couple of them right here. But we also have scientists that are going all over the world studying life and how it evolved and answering some of the interesting questions related to the natural history of our planet. So today we're joined by Jack Dumbacher, who's our curator of our Birds and Mammals department in our research division. Can we give him a round of applause and a thank you for joining us?
Thanks, everybody. Can you hear me?
Is that a good level? All right. Cool. So I guess we can just start, Jack, if you'll tell us, how long have you been studying birds, and how did your passion for birds begin?
How long have I... Do I have to answer that? Does that give away my age? If I...
Right. You could maybe kind of fudge it a little.
So, I've been studying birds probably since I was about a senior in college. So I actually came at this pretty late. I think a lot of people do this from the time that they're kids and then end up in a career like this. But I actually was interested in medicine when I was younger, and it wasn't until I took a class as a junior in college that went down to Baja California, Mexico, that I realized that, wow, you can actually have a career as a scientist. And,
right.
And so that was really when I started looking at this as a possible career choice.
Very cool. And one of the groups of birds that you first focused on in your studies was the birds of paradise, which is a really unique group of birds. What makes them unique, and what did you study about them?
Right. So after I finished my undergraduate work, I was trying to get back to Papua New Guinea. I had done a little bit of field work in Australia, and I love the tropics, and I really wanted to learn more about the tropics. And so I was able to get myself onto a team from Smithsonian that was going to study the Ruggiano bird of paradise, and that's the red one over there that I'm holding, and that's at Ruggiano National Park. So I was just a young volunteer, basically, going to the field to start this project. And I ended up working on it for 3 years for my master's degree. And basically we were in the field studying how these birds mate and part of their mating strategy. So it's very interesting because in one tree, as many as 10 different males will all get together and they'll display together, and they have this coordinated dance. So they all do it together, it's synchronized, and then a female will come into the tree and basically check out all the guys and see what they're doing, check out their dances, and they can walk around and stand below this one and then go stand below that one. And if she's interested in one of the males, she'll actually stand above him on the branch. All the other males will stop dancing, and then that male will turn around and do a special dance just for her. And now if at any point she wants to check out one of the other guys, she can just jump onto another branch and all the guys will turn around and do this coordinated dance again together. So here's a couple of pictures that we actually took in the field during that work. And then what's interesting is that if the female wants to mate with that male, she'll stand above him on the branch, finally let her mate, and then she'll fly off. She'll build the nest herself, she'll raise the young herself, and the males will sit there on that branch and display to the next females that come in. And this is called lek mating behavior, and we are really interested in how this can evolve. And there are a bunch of population genetic things that happen when this happens, because it turns out that almost all the females in the population have the same choice. And especially once one or two females make a choice, everyone else is like, oh, well, he's definitely the best. You know? And so what happens is just a very small number of males end up siring a whole generation of birds in the forest. And basically what happens is you can get this runaway selection of lots of crazy characters, and that's what you see in these birds. And so we actually have a couple specimens from the collection. Jeff was mentioning that a lot of people don't know that we have researchers here doing research, and I think a lot of people don't realize we have huge collections of birds downstairs as well to document the natural history. And so this is one of these Ruggiano birds of paradise, and you can see some of these plumes that they use for display. And here you can see the green under the chin and this little pom-pom here, and they can move each one of these feather groups independently. So as they're dancing, different feathers are going up and doing these crazy things. And these, even though they look like tail feathers, they're actually not. These actually come from underneath the wings, and they're called pectoral plumes. And if you look on the back here, you can actually see the tail is here under the specimen, and it's a little bit hard to see with just one hand, but here's the tail feathers right there. So just like every other bird, they have these tail feathers. And so presumably the way that this evolves, you've all heard of natural selection, the survival of the fittest, but the idea is if you survive for 1,000 years and you never mate, well, that's the end of your genes. But if you only live for 15 minutes and you mate with everybody, well, then your genes are going to run away and go to fixation in the next generation. And that's what's happened to these birds. So these birds, even though there are over 40 different species, you find a lot of hybrids in nature because these species are actually genetically very similar to each other, even though they look really different in the field. And so this is called sexual selection. And everyone knows about Darwin's book on natural selection, but you may not have known that he wrote another book called Sexual Selection and the Descent of Man. And he talked all about how sexual selection can evolve and how it can lead to the rise of crazy plumes like this, these elaborate dances, and things like antlers.
Right, and peacocks, right?
Peacock tails, all sorts of things like that.
Right.
So that's what we were interested in when we went to the field, is trying to understand how these behaviors evolve and how come these birds can have these crazy dances, but other birds don't do the same thing.
Right.
So,
could you just hold the mic just slightly closer?
Sure. Is that a little bit better?
Yeah. So is it rare to see these dances, or were you able to see a variety of different dances?
These birds are actually quite common in the forest, so they're not hard to see. And if you ever go on a bird watching trip to New Guinea, this is one of the highlights, and they're going to try and show you as many birds of paradise as possible. So they're actually quite common, and when you go into the forest, you can hear them calling from a long distance away, and it's pretty easy to just follow that call in the morning and go and see them. They're also closely related to crows, and so they're very common in the forest. They're some of the more abundant birds that you can find, and so this is another one. And I mentioned that there are a lot of different close relatives. So even though these have yellow plumes, the dance display is very similar. The calls that they use are very similar, but you get different colors evolving in the tail. There are actually 6 different species in this genus called Paradisea. That have very similar dances, and they do hybridize in the field. So sometimes you'll find a display tree called a lek, in which you'll get some with red tails, some with yellow tails, interbreeding and dancing together.
Right. So there's a couple of different dances that each one might do. Do you have any personal favorite dances that you've seen?
Ooh, they're all pretty cool. There's one called the Parodia. Oh, and you can check these out online too. If you go to YouTube, search Bird of Paradise, and you'll see some of these really crazy dances. And every species has a different one. So one of my favorites is the King of Saxony, and they have these really bizarre long feathers that come out of their head that are blue, and they look like little plastic medallions going out. And when they dance, they get on a big liana, and they bounce up and down on it and get the whole liana going. And then they flip these plumes up in the air, and they look like a huge beetle sitting there on this thing, and they make these crazy sounds. This is the kingbird of paradise, and we see this bird a lot in the lowlands. And they'll usually perch on a branch or on a tree trunk, a small tree trunk, and they'll sort of like dart down the branch. I have one of these specimens here because what you can't see in that are these crazy tail feathers here. And the 2 central tail feathers are just these little wires that end in these little discs. So it actually is a curlicue, and it has a metallic finish. It's metallic green, and they shake these things in the female's face when she's standing above her on the branch, and she's checking him out. And also, you can see here how bright red this is, but if you look at these feathers closely, you can see how they have this sheen like spun glass. And in the rainforest, when the sun's hitting them just right, that's really, really very spectacular. Here's another one called the Magnificent Bird of Paradise. And the thing that's so striking about this one, it has so many different feather tracks that it can move independently. And these guys have a dance that they do on the ground. So they actually clear out all the leaves and grass and things on the ground. And then they have several trees that they will jump to. So they'll dart between these little saplings and do this little dance for the females. And they usually display singly, but in some cases, multiple males will come in and display in the same place. One other kind of cool factoid about birds, if you think about it, birds are moving really fast in the forest, and they've got to react quickly to trees and things like that. And so they can see faster than us, they can react faster than us, they can hear faster than us. And that's kind of a hard thing to wrap your mind around, but they can. And so when we've watched these birds in the field, we've watched a bird displaying, and the female comes in, is checking them out, and then we see another male fly in, and then they chase each other for a second, and then they all fly off. And we thought, we scored this in our notebook as it was disturbed by another male. Some friends of ours who now work at Cornell, they brought some really high-speed video camera out to the field, and they filmed all this. And when you slow it down, what we found was that there was one male sitting there, and he was dancing with the female. Another male came in, and then they actually were jumping back and forth in the tree. The female stayed still. One of the males went over and mated with her. He flew off. The other male chased him away. But like, you would never have known that this all happened if not for the high-speed video. So it just goes to show you too that not only are the dances very elaborate, but they happen so fast in some cases that like we can't even see it with our own eyes. You need high-speed video to actually know who's the father of all those birds out there in the forest.
Yeah, that's incredible. So when you're out there in the jungle, in the bush, watching this happen, what is that like? How do you prepare for an expedition like that, and how are you living when you're actually there?
Lots of bug spray, because you can't move too fast and you can't be swatting and stuff like that. So when we were watching the Ruggianos, we actually had a reclining a chase lounge in the forest floor, and then over it we had a little plastic cover, sort of to block us so that the birds couldn't see us, but then also to keep the rain off of us if it did start to rain. And then we had a telescope that was mounted so we could just like totally kick back in this chair with our telescope right in front of us. And then basically we sat there and we watched for hours the whole display, and we saw which males were doing the displaying, which females were coming in. And so so a lot of the preparation was trying to get as many birds as we could banded so that we could tell who was who up in those trees.
Right.
So we did a lot of mist netting. And then the rest of it's just like trying to get up before dawn, being in that seat in time, having all your bug spray on so you're not going to feed too many mosquitoes during the day. But it's amazing being out there in the rainforest and getting to see that firsthand. And
most recently, you actually, just this past fall, did another expedition to Papua New Guinea in which you were on a sailboat covering a lot of ground and visiting a lot of different islands, not exactly studying the birds of paradise, but studying different bird populations on each of the islands. So what was that project all about?
Right. Well, a lot of what we do here in the museum is trying to document wildlife in the natural world. And so there are many parts of New Guinea that are very poorly known, and we have very few specimens from them. We have, in fact, some of these islands had never been studied by any scientific researcher before. And so the trick for us was to get to as many of these remote localities as possible. And then we set up mist nets, we talked to the local people, and we tried to document which birds occurred on these different islands. And so And like I mentioned earlier, we have a large collection of birds downstairs that we use for scientific purposes. And so we brought back specimens, a lot of blood samples from these birds. We brought back cloacal samples. And so part of it was just trying to document what lives on those islands and trying to understand evolution in those islands. Part of it also was to sample the viruses that the birds carry. So we know that one of the things that happens, especially in island archipelagos, is that as people move around the globe, we have our chickens and all the other things that we bring with us, and we're introducing diseases as we go. And a lot of the birds that are disappearing from other islands, think Hawaii. So many of the native birds have gone extinct in Hawaii, and it's largely because of us bringing diseases to those islands quite accidentally. And so what we wanted to do was study the avian virome, or the suite of viruses that live on these birds in a pristine archipelago where there are very few people living, and the people that do live there are still living very traditional lifestyles. So what we did was we sailed to as many of these islands as possible. We spent about 2 months on a small 50-foot sailboat with a team of about 6 of us, and captain and his wife and their son. So there was 9 of us total crammed onto this little tiny boat. And we sailed to as many islands as we could, got onto the islands. We used mist nets, so you can see what the mist net looks like here. It's kind of like a fishing net, but it has very, very fine, dark string that is almost impossible to see in the forest. Oops. And then the birds, as they're flying through the forest, they go into these little nets, and then we can handle them, we can take them out, we can get our blood samples and do the work that we do. So there's a picture of one of the nets in the forest. Right. And then this is one of our camps. So these little huts were some fishing villages that the local people have built. And in fact, this one's not inhabited. These are just little huts that they use on weekends if they go out to these islands to go fishing. And they let us camp out in this little spot for a couple of days while we were doing our surveys on this island. And there's kind of an interesting advantage to having all these different islands in the archipelago, and that they're all kind of like their own unique little laboratories, and each one has maybe been disturbed a different amount from the one previous, and some of them are almost entirely pristine, and so you can kind of get different samples of different types of birds populations from all the different islands. Is that right? That's right, and especially from the point of view of looking at the viruses and the diseases, we can actually begin to look at how do human practices like keeping pigs and because there are some islands that have people and some islands that don't, and some islands that, you know, people keep pigs on, and some islands where they don't, some islands that are small, some islands that are large. So we can look at the diseases that the birds are carrying on these different islands, and then hopefully we can correlate some of these different factors and understand, you know, how does island size affect disease?
Right.
How do people affect disease? You know, are birds more healthy on islands with people or less healthy on islands with people? And in cases where certain birds are missing, because each island is also a sort of independent evolutionary outcome, if you will. You know, some birds made it, some birds didn't, and then they sort of set up their own community of birds on those islands. And you can study how those different communities affect viral loads and how the viruses affect the birds. So that's kind of the point of this study. There are over 600 islands in Milne Bay province alone, which was where we were doing this work. And we chose that province in part because it was so pristine, and in part because there were so many islands that we could get to with one research permit. And also just because the folks there were so generous and so fun to work with.
Great.
And so so that's the idea. And we've already done 2 field seasons now, and we've sampled about 40 of these islands, which is actually a huge sample and takes a lot of time to do. But, you know, if you think of all 600, it's still a pretty small sample.
Yeah. And then, of course, the work really only begins once you're back here at the Academy, because then you need to analyze all the samples that you've gotten. So you're doing a lot of lab work right now and partnering with UCSF to do a lot of that, right?
That's right. In fact, we're using what's called next-generation sequencing. And so in order to figure out what's in these samples, we do everything that we can to enrich for viruses and trying to get some of the other noise out of the sample. But then basically what we do is we take the DNA from those and we use what's called an Illumina sequencer. And let me see if I can describe how this thing works. But basically we amplify up our DNA, so we have thousands, hundreds of thousands, or even millions of short reads of DNA that we took out of the birds, whether it's from blood or we took cloacal swabs from a lot of these birds too. So just a sample of their feces, because a lot of viruses and diseases show up in their feces. And then so the idea is that when we run this on the genetic analyzer, we literally get 100 million or so genetic reads, and each read is only about 100 bases, but that's enough for us to match it to sequences in GenBank and figure out what's in there. Wow. So a lot of these, when we match it, we call it blasting. We do a blast search. So we take these 100 million sequence reads, we blast it to known databases, and then it tells us, oh, that one's actually bird DNA. Okay, that's probably from the host. You know, oh, this one is actually beetle DNA. Oh, that's probably from something that it recently ate. And then this one is a phage bacteriophage, which is a virus that affects bacteria. So that's probably living in its gut on the bacteria that lives there. We also pick up bacteria, we pick up fungus, and we're picking up some viruses. And, you know, as we're sorting through these samples, which takes a tremendous amount of time, we're getting an idea of not only what diseases the birds are carrying, but what their last meals look like. And we're actually getting substantial portions of their genomes. So just as a side product, we're getting whole mitochondrial genome sequences that we can analyze and look at for biogeography studies. We're getting a lot of information about the diets, and you know, this is all new technology, so we're just exploring what we can do with it. The other thing, I mean, it's really hard for me to wrap my mind around, you know, what does 100 million DNA sequences look like? And we've actually had to purchase a new genetic server just to handle this much data, and so, you know, we're still learning how to make that little machine go.
And so fast computing is continuing to revolutionize the natural history field in many ways. But of course, there's many traditional components of the study of natural history still going on, and that is, you know, one of the ways is embodied in our collections, which we have 26 million different specimens in our collections here at the Academy, stored behind those large walls and 2 stories down into the basement. So how do you use collections in your work? You know, the stored specimens of birds that the Academy has been collecting for the past 150 years.
Well, gosh, let me count the ways. There's so many different things that we can do. But since we're talking about disease and some of the interesting things we can do with disease, what we're finding is we can actually go back to these specimens, some of which were collected over 100 years ago, and you can take a little tiny snippet of skin off the toe pad, like about the size of a grain of rice. And in that, you can extract the DNA from the bird. And we've done this. So we've done this with ivory-billed woodpeckers. We recently did this with passenger pigeons, which was a really fun study. And we were able to show that passenger pigeons' closest relatives are actually the bandtail pigeons that live here in California. So for a long time, people thought that passenger pigeons were probably most closely related to mourning doves because they look similar. They have pointed tails and a bunch of other things, but actually that's not the case. Its closest relative is the band-tailed pigeon from here in California. So those are some fun things that we can do. From those topads, we can also look at avian malaria. So I've also done a lot of work with avian malaria in birds, and we're looking at malaria from these birds from New Guinea as well. And we can, again, with those topad samples, we can test whether or not those birds were carrying avian malaria from 100 years ago or more. And one of the things we're gearing up to do is to do a bigger study of some of the extinct birds like passenger pigeons, like Carolina parakeets, to see if we can detect any viruses or diseases that they might have carried 100 years ago, which helped lead to their demise. So, and in fact, just in the last week, I've been in touch with some of my old colleagues from Smithsonian. I was at Smithsonian before I came here. And they're actually working on very similar projects with the passenger pigeon, looking at their diseases. So,
Right.
so really, what can you do with these old specimens? It's tremendous. You can do the traditional work and just spread them out, look at all the variation. We use them for field guides. So when you buy a field guide and you wonder, well, how did they know so much about how those birds looked? Well, they actually need hundreds of specimens to try and figure out how much yellow is there, what color is there, what color is the neck, and there's so many differences, so much variation in these species. There's males are different from females, and young are different from adults. The ones in the north are different from the ones in the south. So just to produce a field guide takes a huge number of specimens so that people can get an understanding of what those things look like. And in addition to the genetics, we found that you can do a lot of toxicology work. So you can take a single feather off of these birds and you can look at mercury content. You can look at heavy metal content. You can look at DDT content. So if somebody somebody claims, oh, we're not actually dumping anything, this is the mercury that you see in San Francisco Bay is something that's always been there. Well, we can actually go to birds collected 100 years ago and see if the mercury content in their feathers is different than what it is today. So, what will people think of doing 100 years from now with these specimens?
Right.
We have no idea. If you think about it, only 50 years ago, we realized what DNA was, and we're able to go back and look at DNA. But what will people want to do in 100 years? We have no idea. And so that's one of the reasons that we keep these specimens as complete as possible in the collections.
Right.
So that they're a permanent record for anyone who might want to use them for whatever they might want to use them for.
Cool. All right. Well, super exciting stuff. I want to open it up to questions in just a moment. But first, you were mentioning earlier how when you found out that you could lead a really exciting life traveling all over the world researching birds, that you kind of totally got hooked. So I wonder what upcoming expeditions do you have kind of in the future, either in 2012 or 2013, and what's your focus going to be?
That's a good question. I'd love to get back to New Guinea, and I'm really committed to doing work in New Guinea. And we're actually going to we just got a small grant to bring my colleague at the National Museum and Art Gallery in Papua New Guinea to come here and train with us for a few months. And so when that's all done, I'd like to go back and work with him a little bit to get their collection strengthened and in good shape. So that's definitely one thing I'd like to do. As you know, Jeff, my wife is pregnant right now, so I might not be allowed to go in the field for a while. I might have to. And in fact, the last time we did one of these, I was actually in New Guinea, and I got piped in via satellite, if I remember correctly.
That's right.
And so it's good to be back here, but it might be a while before I get to pipe in from the field again.
All right. Well, very good. Well, we'll be watching that activity when it happens. I want to open it up to questions if anyone has one. Yes.
Congratulations on putting the baby dance.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Have you started to track the genetics of the behavior?
Have you?
Is it one, all the males being the behavior?
Have you tried to track the genetic
And
behavior differences between the birds of paradise?
That was actually trying to figure out if how are those males related on the display ground. There's actually one hypothesis that they might all be brothers or closely related, and they might all be working together basically for their family's genes to try and get the genes in the next generation. And we had hoped to do that with the Ruggiano birds of paradise in the field. In the end, we found it very difficult to catch enough males from each lek to do that. But from what we were able to sample, it didn't look like the males on any particular display ground were significantly more related to each other than they were to random males in the population. But again, our sample size was a little bit too low for that work back when we were doing it. And I hate to admit, but that was 1989 and 1990 when we were doing that work. So So that was quite a long time ago, and the genetics has come a long way from then too. So.
Do the dance patterns kind of change from year to year? Do they stay the same?
The dances themselves stay pretty static. However, in the display tree, those display trees are sometimes, it's been hundreds of years that those, a group of birds has been displaying in those same trees, and they seem to pass it down from one generation to the next. And in fact, from what we could tell when we were doing that work, and that was over 3 different seasons that we were there in the field, it seems like there's one male that's on a branch, and he defends that particular branch, and he stays on that branch as long as he's alive. But then once he disappears, or if something happens and he's sick for a while and doesn't show up, another male can try and take over that branch. But it does seem that there's traditional places in the forest where they work. So that hypothesis is a very interesting one, though. Are they related? And there's some other birds. There's some birds in South America called manakins. And they have an even more cooperative dance because they're 2 males, and they do this dance that they flip over each other. And then what happens is when the female's interested, then the one male actually ducks out and just steps to the back and lets the other male finish the dance. And so people for a long time thought, oh, they must be related, or what would this other male get out of this? And back in the 60s and 70s, there was an idea that you don't actually have to pass on your own genes. If you help your relatives pass on genes, and you get something that's called inclusive fitness, and genes can evolve that way as well. And so this was something that they looked at in the manakins. They looked at this in grouse as well, because grouse also have, if you've ever seen sage grouse or prairie grouse here in the U.S., yeah, they have these amazing dances, and they also have a elect mating system. And where it's been tested, it turns out that the males are not more closely related to each other on one display ground than they are to males at random in the population. So the relatedness doesn't seem to be the explanation.
Great questions. Let's go here next.
Well, I have a question about sexual selection. In general, if one male or 2 males are doing most of the breeding of all of the females, isn't that supposed to reduce the gene and cause, abnormalities besides the crazy feathers, but something that might make the whole species go extinct?
Yeah, is it detrimental to the species and the populations if just a few males are doing most of the mating?
So this is another very interesting question, and there was a geneticist named R.A. Fisher who in the early 1900s tackled this question, and he actually, doing his mathematics, he was able to show mathematically that you could actually drive a species extinct because of a bad female choice, or because also, just the reduced size of the population. And then other researchers since then have sort of reevaluated it, and with slightly different starting parameters, they've shown that no, you can't actually have selection run away that far, that if the males become so unfit, then it sort of gets checked at some point. And the interesting thing is that yes, even though the effective population size per generation is really small, what happens is that there tends to be big turnover of the males, and there's still lots of other males waiting in the wings. So there's a lot of evidence now that, for example, some of these plumes make the males a little bit more apparent to predators. It might make it harder for them to hide, might make it easier for them to be caught. And so once you become the alpha male and you're sitting on that fancy perch, your life might not be all that long, is one suggestion. The data that we have suggests that might not be true, that these males do appear to be fairly fit. It's kind of a tough one. So theoretically, the population size is very reduced because of the reduced male part of the population, but because the female population is still relatively large, it doesn't get to the point where you have inbreeding effects. The populations are still large enough there. And the other thing that's interesting is that, when you think about, well, why did this happen in birds of paradise and maybe not some other species? Well, they are very abundant species to begin with. And so, maybe if you had, a very rare species that this would actually reach a critical point, and then you'd have too many inbreeding effects and too many other deleterious effects, too many other deleterious genes that are becoming fixed in the populations. But because it's a relatively abundant species to start with, maybe we don't have these problems. So that's one idea that people have had. But one thing that does happen is when you have small populations, genes can go to fixation, we say, or one gene can drive out another gene at that same locus relatively quickly. And so this does account for the very rapid evolution that we see in birds of paradise. But can it actually drive a species extinct or be that unfit? That's hard to say.
Another very good question. Thank you. Yes?
Can you be sure, given it happens so fast, that females are only mating with one male before they go off?
Might the female be mating with more than one male?
That's another really good question. So we're definitely in this theme now about animal attraction with the new upcoming exhit.
Our new exhibit opens, press previews tomorrow, and then it opens on Friday. So come back and check out our mating exhibit downstairs. And we'll actually have some bowerbird on display as well, bowerbird nest area. So.
And they do something similar, but they build a little house that they use for their display as opposed to their own feathers.
Right.
So now, to get back to your question, what was the question again?
Do the females
Yes.
know, do they actually mate with only one male?
Right.
Right.
They come back and sample
So that was
sperm of one survive if another one...
so that was another question that we had, and we wanted to try and sort out genetically. But for this, we weren't able to catch enough females, and we couldn't get enough of the females banded to be sure. However, so the big question is what the stuff that we see socially happening in the tree, is that actually representative of what's genetically happening out there? So it turns out that if you look at birds that are monogamous, where they have this faithful pair bond that they form early in life, and every year, they mate with the same mate and they come back to the same nest. If you actually sample the eggs that are in those nests, on average, about 1 in 10 is sired by a different male than the male that's there. So there's some sneaky stuff going on, away from the nest, and in this case, probably away from the lek. And the other thing that's we think is probably happening with these birds, because they're crows, they're very smart, they're very long-lived, and they probably, so the guy that I worked with, Bruce Beeler, who works at Conservation International now, and he was my mentor when I was a student, he firmly believed that these birds all knew each other. He thought, well, we don't know who they are, but if you see them enough, you can kind of tell that they're slightly different, and you can kind of get a feel for, oh, that's that guy, and that's that guy, and he thinks that all these birds probably do know each other, and so even though they're watching each other dance, and they know who's who, and they know whose dance they like, and they do certain culturally acceptable things up in that tree, what happens in the rest of the forest is going to be harder to study. The way to study that, though, will be, to have a population of banded birds, watch what happens in the lek, and then actually sample the offspring and see, do they really represent what we're seeing up there in the tree? Right. And I think there's going to be a little hanky-panky going on.
Vicky? Yeah?
That's a very good question. So her question is I said earlier that all the males come back to the same branches, and she said, well, even the unsuccessful ones, would you want to come back to the same branch if you were unsuccessful on that branch last year? And what we did find was that there's usually a small number of branches where there's successful males. So usually like one male, the alpha male, will get like 70% of the matings. And then, there's usually 1 or 2 others that'll split the rest. And those 3 perches or so are highly prized and highly fought over. But then the other males are kind of like zipping around them and displaying to the side. And if this one doesn't work, they'll go over and try that one. And, on a rainy day, a lot of the males don't even bother showing up for work. But, those 3 will be there to defend their perches. So, yeah, it's definitely a more complex situation. And we wouldn't be surprised at all if some of those males on the satellite perches are visiting some of the other leks and trying to figure out, well, not just do I want to dance on this branch, but do I even want to dance in this tree with these guys, or do I want to go dance on that tree with those guys? So I think that there's probably a lot of that going on.
Let's take our last question right here.
Yeah. L-E-K.
The word lek. Spell it L-E-K.
Yeah. It generally refers to the display ground. Yeah. But sometimes in the literature you'll see it referred to as a lek tree or the lek display area or the lek ground. In order for it to be considered a lek, the birds have to be clustered in space just for the purpose of finding mates. And if it meets those criteria, then it's generally considered a lek. And it also is only considered a lek if it's the males that are doing it. So there's some cases where there's polyandry, and a single female will mate with many males, and the females will do the dancing and the displaying, and that's generally not called a lek. In fact, I don't even know if they have a name for it or what they call it. It's very rare, and the idea is that, when you look at, and Darwin was one of the first people to write about this very clearly and cogently, but the idea is that females are limited in their ability to produce offspring by the number of eggs they can produce and care for. Okay, and if you think about it, even in our species, a female, once she's pregnant, she's tied down for at least 9 months while the baby's inside her, and then afterwards while she's nursing. Whereas what limits a male's reproductive output is his access to mates. Okay, so females and males have very different strategies for optimizing their reproductive output over their lifetime. So for a female, she wants to be as choosy as possible and get the best investment from the male. So females will always be the choosier sex, and males will always be the more showy, dancy, the one that is trying to go out there and find more mates. In nature, that in general, that's the way that the selective pressure works. Unless you're a phalarope, yeah, that's one of those species where it's the other way around. And sometimes those are the most interesting species of all, because that's where you can really test your ideas.
The exceptions to the rule, yeah.
Yeah, the exceptions to the rule will usually tell you whether you're right about your ideas.
Great. All right. Well, if there's any more questions, come on up and join us. And also, you can come check out these specimens a little bit more closely with Jack. Can we give him a big round of applause? This has been great.
Thanks a lot for coming.
All right. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day at the Academy, everybody. Bye-bye.